Welcome. Welcome to the public presentation of the results of the research project When Disaster Meets Conflict. We have over 100 people participating at the moment. My name is Peter Heinze. I am the coordinator of KUNO, and KUNO was asked by the International Institute of Social Studies to facilitate this afternoon. This is the end of an online conference, 2 days. We have had 3 workshops and all will come together in this afternoon session, in this webinar with a beautiful panel. And one main actor, our main actor of today, is Thea Hilhorst. She will present her research of her and her team, and will also be participating in the panel discussions later. First, let me share some practicalities and the program. The program is basically, I think, 2 parts. Thea will present in 10-15 minutes the main results of this 5-year study, but also of all the findings of the workshops we had this morning and yesterday, these working sessions. And after that, we will go into a panel discussion. Perhaps Marieke can share the screen we have on that, because there are 4 people with us, I hope, in the panel. I will introduce them properly later. But they will take in about 20 minutes, they will be with us, and they will reflect upon all the findings of the webinar, of the research project and the working sessions we had before. Then some practicalities I would like to share with you. Please use your chat box, the Q&A box you have. Because via the chat box and the Q&A box, we really would like to harvest all your comments, all your ideas and your questions, and also a strong plea from me to the panelists: respond to those questions, and all attendees can join, of course, the discussions via the chat box. Your comments are worthwhile, and I think many of the panel will also read what is going on in the chat box. So please use the chat box now. The webinar will be about 90 minutes. We will we'll video this webinar, and we'll share it via YouTube afterwards. Again, please attendees mute yourself to avoid background noises. Use the Q&A, use the chat. Please use the hashtag when disaster meets conflict when you're tweeting about this. It will help us to amplify the message we have. And finally, there will be a research brief. It will be shared with you later with all the participants here. It will be written by the Institute of Social Studies, and also the findings of the workshops and of the research and of this webinar will all reflect in the research brief. So that's for the practicalities. Then we have some mystery guests. I think I should introduce, otherwise you think, who are those people hanging in the panel? First, I'll tell a little bit about Marieke. Without Marieke, this would not be happening. Marieke is my technical support over here, and she helps me with all the technicalities. And we have almost the whole team with us. They don't have a big role in the panel, but it allows Thea to fall back upon the specific knowledge or the reflections of her team. And I think they will help me to pinpoint maybe some comments from the chat box or from the Q&A. So I'm very glad they are with us as well. And I see that Mihir Bhatt is also with us. I will introduce the panelists properly later. So I think now it's time to go to Thea. Thea, are you ready for a quick presentation on your program of 5 years of study?
Thank you, Peter. First, if this picture can stay open for a moment, I would like to introduce the team. Well, the team is bigger than the group you see here, but this is really the core of our team. The PhD candidates, the postdoc researcher, and myself. So on your right, you see Rodrigo Mena, and he's been working on disasters in high intensity conflict, which is, in his case, Afghanistan, Yemen, South Sudan. There's Isabel Deporte, who has been working on the low intensity conflict, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, and Ethiopia. And then Samantha Mellis working on post-conflict scenarios. So she worked in Sierra Leone just when the mountain broke. She was there 2 weeks after it happened. Haiti and Nepal, and then Rowan van Voorst, who was the postdoc working internationally, and myself. Now you see this picture was taken pre-COVID. We're all sitting very close together, and we really miss that level of physical proximity. But to be honest, in other ways, COVID is now turning out to be our ally, because as a team, we are also committed to what we call flying less, to reduce the footprint of academia. And it is really interesting to see how under the influence of the pandemic, indeed, there is much less traffic and we find out other ways to communicate. And secondly, as a team, we are also very much committed to what we could call with a big word, the decolonization of humanitarian studies, making humanitarian studies more inclusive. And that is why I'm also so appreciative of today, where our final conference is not held in a room, but is held online with all of you here from the whole world. So I'm really, really pleased that you're all here. Now, I'm going to introduce our research, which is about disaster and conflict. And before doing so, I will save myself some breath because some of the information of the program we have collected in a small film, a little animation. So I would like to start showing you the animation of our program and then follow on with my presentation.
The world experiences around 400 disasters related to natural hazards each year. More than 30% of them occur in countries that are affected by conflicts. This creates additional challenges in organising the disaster response. Despite this trend, little research has focused on the relation between disaster and conflict. When Disaster Meets Conflict is a 5-year programme that analyses how state, non-state, and aid actors respond to disasters in 3 different conflict settings. It aims to identify key challenges and best practices to inform policies and action. The research included 9 country case studies covering 3 settings: high intensity, low intensity, and post-conflict. In each country, the study learned from a wide diversity of actors and experiences. A panel of 30 experts from around the globe also provided their insights. The findings demonstrate that it is critical to understand the challenges each setting brings and to respond with appropriate action. In high-intensity conflict, responding to and reducing the risk of disasters is crucial and possible, despite enormous humanitarian needs. In low-intensity conflict, responders need to take into account political sensitivities without losing sight of mandates and needs. In post-conflict, aid actors need to balance state-building and humanitarian goals, being more considerate of the different local actors. Disasters affect conflict, and conflict affects disaster response. Practitioners and policymakers must understand these linkages to do no harm.
Great. Thank you. Well, 6 years ago, I dreamed up this project and I submitted it to the Dutch Research Council. And I could actually tell them that at that time, definitely there was hardly any research into the nexus between disaster and conflict, which is very strange, taking into account that more than 30% of disasters actually happen in conflict situations. And that is also normal. I mean, if you think about it, conflict increases the vulnerabilities to disaster. And conflict also means that there are less capacities to deal with disaster. So the chances that a natural hazard, like a flood or an earthquake or a drought, turns into a disaster is much bigger during conflict. So it was a big commission not to look at this. And it was not just the academe, but it was also in policy. If you take, for example, the Sendai Framework for Action, there's hardly any mention of, no mention of conflict. So this program was really triggered by a desire to better understand what happens when disaster meets conflict, but also to have some influence on policy. Now, this program actually fits into ongoing changes in disaster governance, and that has not really something to do with conflict, but it is related to the topic we are doing, which is on the next sheet. And these ongoing changes are that if you just look at disaster governance, we see there has been a change from hazard oriented to more comprehensively focusing on hazard, vulnerability and capacities or resilience. So rather than thinking that a disaster is the earthquake or the flood, we much better understand that a disaster comes about historically, socially, by and is an encounter of hazards, vulnerabilities, and capacities or resilience. Another thing we see in disaster governance is a change related, of course, to the above, from response-oriented, what do you do after the event, to a focus on disaster risk reduction. We also see a change from top-down and state-centered to more inclusive forms of governance involving non-state actors, non-governmental organizations, civil society, and others. So if you look at the Yoga Framework for Action and also the later the Sendai Framework for Action, they really embed and incorporate this idea that in every country we need to have disaster response platforms involving all these different actors to be able to respond comprehensively through DRR and after the fact to disasters. And now, what we also see both in the humanitarian and in the disaster field is this adage that you say, okay, as local as possible, as international as necessary, which we now also call the localization, where it is understood increasingly, at least declared, that whatever can be done in situ is much better than what you bring in from outside. And whose disaster is it? Of course, it should be dealt with, decisions should be taken as much as possible by the local actors or the national actors. Now, most of our findings, of course, I cannot present. So in my next sheet, what I wanted to show you is just the website that we have for our project. It's part of the Institute's website. The address is on top now. You don't need to scribble it down very quickly, because the project, if you just go to Google and you would do when disaster meets conflict ISS, you will already find the website immediately to our project, where you find so many research brief papers. We make it a point, everything we do is open access. So whoever tries to find it, you can all read everything that we have done. Now, this is of course not for today, but it's for later. So let me tell you about the research questions that we had in our program. The main research question was, how do state, non-state and humanitarian actors respond to disasters in conflict-affected situations? So you will recognize this image of governance where the state, non-state, humanitarian, civil society, local communities are all engaging and all shape how disaster response will evolve in the context where it is happening. So we wanted to know, how does this work in conflict? Now, as you saw in the little animation, we also said it would be good to look at different types of conflict, so focusing on high intensity, low intensity, and post-conflict situations. Now, further questions as they evolved in the project were, how do actors coordinate and take decisions to respond to a disaster? How do actors deal with key localization challenges? And how do actors engage with the politics of disaster response in the conflict scenarios, and with what implications? And what is the role of humanitarian advocacy? So these latter three questions were really questions that evolved from different projects and throughout the years that we were working on this. Now I have a few findings I would like to present to you. First, socially, negotiation is always happening. And the decisions where to act, for whom to act, who is the target population, and how to act is socially negotiated. And what we mean by that is that even if there is a humanitarian action plan written down by international agencies and put on the website by OCHA, that doesn't mean that humanitarian action will evolve according to the plan. On the way, in a whole process, at national, institutional, at local level, at different moments, we see that those different actors, I like to call that, for those of you who know my work, the humanitarian arena. In that arena, all these different actors socially negotiate, not meaning they sit around a table. It can also mean that they take the money, do something else, or whatever way, or they talk about each other, or There are all kind of ways that they shape up these decisions in practice and let it evolve. Now, in the high intensity conflict, of course, in the scenarios that we have, they are not that different. There's also a lot of overlap, but I just wanted to present some highlights as they are, yeah, perhaps, well, slightly more visible in one of the contexts compared to the other. It's not that they don't play a role in the other scenarios, but they are more visible. So in the high intensity conflict, we see that triage, so this targeting, is very painful because the needs always exceed the capacities. What we also found, and we were really surprised by this, is that we always thought that humanitarian action is very flexible. So when the needs change, say to another province, to another community, humanitarian aid will very quickly be able to follow the needs compared, for example, to development. And that is far less so than we anticipated, because also humanitarian actors, they take a lot of time to familiarize themselves with the area, to build up the relations they need, to build up the trust they require to work. So they are not so flexible to just move to another place. So that means when a disaster happens somewhere, they are not just ready to go and step in. In low intensity conflict scenarios, we see that states are often very forceful in decision making. And that means that for the humanitarian actors, it's very difficult and they really have to navigate, for example, to service minorities that are not the favorites of the state and you yet want to help them, or to get access to people who are politically opposed to the state. Now, in post conflict, we see another sort of more the highlighted challenge there is how to balance state building with finding room for maneuver to actually do the humanitarian mandate. The state in these areas is very much in flux. There's lots of unclarities and intrastate competition. So it's not so easy. Even if you say, okay, the state is in the driver's seat, it's not easy to think who is the state, because at the national, at the local, but we also see a lot of ministries competing with each other. Who is actually in charge of the disaster? Now, all this and everywhere in conflict situations is very much complicated by the high density of aid actors who are already around because of the conflict. My second finding I wanted to highlight is about additional complications to localization. So this is something we also really talked about yesterday in the workshop, where in the high intensity conflict, it shows that governance systems are very much fractured. So if there's no flow between, say, ministries, but also not between the different levels of governance, which makes it very complicated. Plus, whereas in other scenarios, we tend to speak about partnership. In high intensity conflict, we often talk about remote delivery, and there are very many safety and ethical concerns in that. So there's really complications to localizations in terms of ethics, safety, and effectiveness. In low intensity conflict, we are particularly struck by the fact that there is a very strong shrinking space for civil society. And there, in the low intensity conflicts, if you don't uh, violence, say, so to speak, in a low intensity conflict is not primarily done with, what you think of like bombs and weapons and stuff like that and shooting. The favorite weapon in a low intensity conflict is actually the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic red tape, and not extending visas, not allowing people to work, and all kind of bureaucratic difficulties that are raised to make sure that some people can work in relation to the disaster and others can't. Post-conflict, we see central focus on the state again, but large gaps between state and society, and very often unresolved issues from before the conflict, which are still there and lingering, or from during the conflict. In all scenarios, sadly, we find that civil society actors remain sidelined in the governance of disaster response for different reasons, but the outcome is everywhere that civil society actors are sidelined. Peter, do I still have time to speak for 3 more minutes?
2 or 3 minutes is perfectly okay, Taylor.
Okay,
Please
good.
continue.
Then depoliticization and advocacy, that's what we also talked about this morning in the workshop. I don't know if some of you were around, but it was very interesting again. And what we see there is that Disaster response is always political, and actors use the disaster to gain control and legitimacy. Now, to be honest, this is not typical for conflict scenarios. This is everywhere. We could say this is just what happens when a disaster happens. And yet again, in our scenarios, we have some highlights, and that is that in the high intensity conflict, we could also say that this is um, oh, sorry, but I forget to say, so disaster is very much political, but what we see is very often that disaster responders try to not sort of take the politics out of it, but sort of seemingly present themselves as if it's not so political. So they depoliticize, you might say in humanitarian terms, they appear to be neutral, or they just kind of try to ignore the politics that are around so that they can navigate their way around it. Now, in high intensity conflict, this could actually be positive because using disaster risk reduction can be seen as one of those neutral areas that can be used to open a political space. So you use disaster risk reduction as a theme which is acceptable to all the different conflict parties, and hence you can work, and by bringing parties together, perhaps open up some political space. In low intensity conflict, we see that disasters is very much used, especially by governments, to delegitimize non-favored actors. How do you do that when you're a smart government? Well, they don't need to learn that from me because they already know that. It's not that I give them tips here, but we see the influence of data management. If you sit on the data that humanitarians use to know who is in need, who is not on need, you can actually influence it. So it may not be a coincidence that in some countries, particular provinces are not considered in need, which are actually politically opposed to the government. The delay of travel authorizations, anti-terrorism legislation. There's a lot of ways in which governments can instill a culture of uncertainty and fear that makes it very difficult for people to respond to disaster. In post-conflict, we see that disaster response is intertwined with processes of election and other aspects of state building. Now, humanitarian actors, on the other hand, they struggle with their mandate in this whole sea of politics. So they self-censor, they negotiate or navigate, or they contest. There are very many different ways in which humanitarians try to struggle with their mandate in these situations. And one of the things we found is that it's actually a pity that they don't talk much about it. So these struggles very often happen quietly, silently, and that's a pity because that results in all kinds of self-censorship, perhaps even when it is not necessary. Now, my final sheet is about some of the lessons we learned. First, the value of scenarios. That was built into the project, but I'm really convinced that it is a very powerful way. So what we did is, and it came out yesterday in one of the workshops as well, people feel like you really have to understand the context to be able to act. So everything is contextual. However, you don't want to go unprepared into a context. Saying it's contextual doesn't mean that you just walk in and do whatever you think is necessary in that context. You have to be prepared. Now, for that, the general guidelines are often considered too general. And therefore, I think scenarios to learn from cases that are similar, other high intensity conflicts, other low intensity conflicts, other post conflict countries, that can actually be the sort of middle ground where you can fruitfully learn from other cases and take that to your own context so you're better prepared and know what to do. Second, the importance of understanding and strategizing. Maybe not surprisingly, as an academic, I feel humanitarians could invest a bit more in understanding those dynamics in which they're working, because now they often understand it intuitively and strategize slightly more around it, especially when it comes to advocacy. Perhaps humanitarians can do slightly more than they sometimes think, where they routinely think, oh, we cannot act here because it would be too political if we did so. But sometimes there could be ways for diplomacy that are really good. And one of the things that came out of the workshop It's also a matter of investing in advocacy capacities, which is what organizations rarely do. And finally, the importance of learning. We're all used to these days to think about innovations and toolboxes, but actually create spaces for learning where people can sit together within an organization, between organizations, just with a cup of tea and exchange experiences and find ways to help each other to understand and strategize. That is very helpful. Now, finally, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank you for your attention here in the webinar. I also like to thank you because I think many of you have participated in the research. We've interviewed you, you've helped us, you've sent us resources, which was really, really great. So I also take this opportunity to thank everybody who has been involved and helping in our research. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. Too much to summarize, I think. Please, so I even won't try it. I would like to introduce the panelists. I think we have 1 more hour left for getting feedback from people from very different perspectives from the field. They're already on the screen. We have Flora Marie. She is Executive Committee member of the Community Care for Emergency Response and Rehabilitation, the CCERR. That is an NGO from Myanmar. Your main slogan on the website is "Fighting Humanity Without Borders." I think it's beautiful. Fighting Humanity Without Borders. You're a social scientist by education, and previously you were assigned to the Ministry of Health, but now an NGO activist. Saskia Kurussi, she is External Relation Officer of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction of the Regional Office of the Americas and the Caribbean. Saskia graduated in social anthropology and in integral risk management. Prior to the UN, she worked for international NGOs like Oxfam, managing projects and programs, but she always works many times works very closely with local and national governments. And we have Mihir Bhatt. You found us, Mihir. Very glad you have us as well. I just made you also co-host, so you can turn on your video. So we have a visual of you as well. So I hope you can switch on your video. Founder and director of the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute in India. The AIDMI is an NGO based in Gujarat. It is a community-based organization working on action planning, action research, and policy support, and it's working towards bridging the gap between policy, practice, and research. Mihir Bhatt published widely on issues of vulnerability, of disasters, and many more, and is a senior fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative since 2007. Very glad we have you all, and we have, of course, Thea. She will a little bit be in an in-between role because these panelists will also a little bit of co-host, I think. We prepared like 3 rounds. The first round is more like getting to know you a little bit better with a very open question like, did you experience in your professional life or maybe in your personal life a disaster at a time of conflict? It's a chance for you to get a little bit of feeling for us who you are, but also on your professional experience. And later then we dive into the challenges you meet when disaster meets conflict. And maybe we hope also that you have some messages for policy and for practices for practice for us. And Thea will try to squeeze in the main learnings of this project when disaster meets conflict. So I would like to do a first quick round with the new 3 panelists with the main question: did you experience a disaster at the time of conflict? What happened? And perhaps what did you learn? Flora, maybe perhaps start with you. Your name is on top. Flora Neymari from Myanmar. Are you with us, Flora? Yeah, maybe you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, you're unmuted now.
All right.
Are you ready to share some personal experiences with us?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I am. Yeah, I have been. Thanks for introducing. And yeah, my engagement with disaster management engagement has been started in 2015, particularly on after the event of Cyclone Coleman. And then also I have been also engaged in another obvious cyclone scenario, which is Cyclone Mora in 2017. And prior to that, I have been also experienced or exposed with 2018, the most challenges cyclone in Myanmar. It is called Cyclone Nargis in 2018, and 2010 in Cyclone Kiri. And I myself is also engaging in responding in Rakhine State. But all this cyclone scenario has a very different aspect of responding and that dynamic. And yeah, how many time do I have for that introduction?
Not 10 minutes, but if you have 2 minutes more, it would be beautiful. You can cope with 2
Okay.
minutes? Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so I have been engaging in this these organizations since established, and this organization is established with a community, a chain community inside the country and from diaspora's community as well. And then in 2015 is that the time established, and then we are evolving until then and to responding different forms of conflict and disaster. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this with us. I move on to Saskia Pelosi. Did you experience disaster at the time of conflict, or what happened?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Actually, as a ex-ISS graduate, I'm really happy to be with you today. Okay, I have experience in what is called the other situation of violence context, which is specifically in the North Triangle of Central America, specifically in Guatemala. So there I have experience working in informal urban settings in Guatemala City, both in what is called more kind of extensive risk with accumulation of very small localized disaster, landslide, floodings, also tropical storm Agatha, which I think was 2010. So working in response, but mainly in disaster risk reduction effort with these communities, and also at rural level, in very remote rural communities, which have a different reality, but always related to this so-called other situation of violence, mainly with drug cartels controlling whole territories and what is going on there. So that's an experience. And then since that was an experience with NGOs before coming to the UN. And the UN, since I work in a regional office, we work supporting countries all over the Americas and the Caribbean. So for sure, there's a context of working with Colombia, which is one of the, I think, the other small case study of the research.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Saskia. I move on to Mihir Bhatt. Could you share perhaps some personal experiences? Did you experience like when disaster meets conflict, and what happened?
Yes, thank you so much, Peter and Thea, my very good wishes, and thanks for inviting. I have been working since 1995, and the range of, actually, I didn't quite realize that I have seen disasters meet conflict till Thea brought it up. And once I got your invitation, I looked at the work that we've done a bit more carefully. And it seemed that we have been somewhat myopic in looking at either of the cases, either disaster or conflict, but not really looking at when they overlap and somehow neglected. So this is very good for me to recount what actually have been neglected in our work. And first, that sort of comes as a big piece of pilot action research work that we were doing for the Disaster Emergency Committee was the Gujarat earthquake 2001, and immediately followed by Gujarat riots 2002. And that's where something one is sort of continuing and second added to that. And that's one really major, very strong experience that we have in our work. The second one was subsequently in Kashmir 2005 earthquake, which was in the conflict area. And again, there was action research in terms of providing livelihood support to a large number of neglected groups and women especially. And that's something we've done then. The third sort of experience which comes to my mind subsequently is the work of Srinagar floods in 2015, and UNICEF and Save the Children were very actively involved. And there the capacity building and evaluation of the activities that were carried out, and how do you do that? So that's something we have done. And then the tsunami. During that, we were very much involved in the evaluation for the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition and DEC evaluation in terms of the in Aceh, where in one way the conflict was ending and tsunami recovery was taking place, and very interesting, a whole range of courses taking place, as well as in Sri Lanka, where LTT was still there, and there was a recovery taking place in the northern part of area. And then subsequently, in India itself, there are roughly 200 what's called quote-unquote Maoist districts, where there is a lot of disturbance. And funnily, these are the districts which also get repeated floods. So how does the flood relief unfold in this? And that's an area where we have worked both in terms of training as well as capacity building. And in Assam, which is the northeast of India, and where again floods in the 4 sort of tribal districts where there is ongoing conflict. There was an ongoing conflict, somewhat settled now to do that. So that's the kind of background in terms of training and capacity building, evaluation, pilot, and time to time knowledge building, bottom up, if you will. And that's the experience I have. Thanks for this opportunity to put our thoughts together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meher Bhatia. We really invited you to reflect on the main findings, the whole panel, the main findings of this 5 years of study from your experiences. So we couldn't really say, these are the questions we are going to pose to you, and this is how you can prepare. But when I hear what you experienced already, your reflections are really very valuable. So I won't ask Thea if she would like to explain how she has experience with when disaster meets conflict. But Thea, can you maybe highlight 1 or 2 issues that really came up during the last days and during those 5 years research, and we would really like to ask the panelists to reflect upon? What are main learnings we would like to check with our panelists?
Oh, actually, I've done that. And shall I go ahead now?
Yeah,
I would
sure.
like to ask. Okay, please go on, and then we go to Thea. Yeah.
Go,
No, I
Meher.
can wait till. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thea, you can go first. Then we go to me here. Yeah, is that okay?
Oh no, well, I don't have so much to say at this stage. I'm really curious to hear from the panel. One of the things, of course, that struck me was when Mihir was saying, and well, in his own candid way, nobody can do it like him, that actually he did perhaps not realize at some times that disaster and conflict were coming together. And I think that's a situation that very many people encounter. You go to a situation because of a disaster, and then before you don't always realize about the conflict tensions that are happening. And I remember when I visited Isabel, for example, in Ethiopia, that quite a lot of the humanitarians were not even aware of the fact that there was an emergency going on and there were the riots going on, that many people were arrested, killed at the time that they were, so to speak, happily delivering food aid because of the drought. So I think it's really true that when you research something, you think, oh, it's so evident, everybody should see that. But when you're in it, it's not always so evident. So it's really good to be attentive to those more conflict dynamics and contradictions when you're actually working on disaster.
Thank you, Thea. But here, would you like to reflect on it and elaborate a little bit on this crossroads of conflict and disaster?
Sure. I think 4 or 5 points came out quite strongly as I was looking at the work that we have done and what I read in terms of the note that you had sent in. And one was a bit more aware about Thia's work because one had a good chance to talk with her from time to time about when it was being conceived and subsequently, very briefly, but still. So one thing which came out and which I already confessed is the focus that vulnerability or in terms of risk, depending where you start, but sort of we we end up very narrowly in terms of looking at what we started with and never go beyond that, but not realizing that there are multiple risks existing while you are addressing either a flood risk or a drought risk or riot or something. So either side, conflict or disaster, but to look at vulnerability or risk, either of the way you want to start, more in terms of multiplicity, and that's something we don't quite do, and that's for us. Number two is these things become very difficult when there is a sort of what I would call transboundary issues, in a sense, when things cut across districts or states or countries, and then to look at the disaster meeting conflict in sort of two different territories, geographic territories, political territories, sectoral, and that becomes very difficult to deal with. And that's something we found in our work so far. The other third difficulty that we found was the multiple locations. That is generally, disasters, if you have an earthquake, there is a need sort of a area which is affected directly, and you can sort of draw a boundary around that. But when disaster meets conflict, you don't have, it happens sort of in a very patchy manner. And therefore, the response and understanding has to be differently than the way you would have a neatly worked out affected area or affected population per se. The fourth thing that we found was in terms of behavioral change, and something that Tia already mentioned, and I understand from what I gathered from Burma experience, that the behavior of a disaster risk, of a humanitarian responder in a disaster situation and in a conflict situation are different for whatever reason. And one has to be aware of that and see that, look, I'm going there for flood purpose, but it's a flood in a heavily contested tribal difficulty areas, and I can't forget that. So that kind of things are not there. Fourth, the fifth one is that the tools that we use for disaster response in terms of floods or droughts, or earthquake for that matter, they need to be changed and made sort of multi-risk, or looked at the natural disaster risk and conflict risk simultaneously. Because if the tools are limited to one type of risk, then we don't end up looking at the other type of conflict related, or if you're doing conflict related response, we don't end up looking at the disaster part. And the last part is in terms of rebuilding infrastructure, and rebuilding infrastructure after an earthquake and flood is quite differently conceived vis-a-vis after a conflict. And so how do you have infrastructure which is on hard and soft, which is both sort of for peace and for prosperity? So that's something we need to know more, and we need to understand far more. These are the 5 or 6 major findings when we looked at our work in terms of overlap of disaster risk and climate risk. This is what came to my mind. So I'd like to sum up by saying that we need to rethink vulnerability, both in terms of violence related and also in terms of resistance, protest. We don't look at vulnerability in a much sort of wider and more dynamic, more comprehensive manner. So that's something is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir, for just giving us 5 or 6 solid challenges we need to look in further. I would like to ask the other panelists also to reflect on the issues, the challenges they identify when we are talking about when disaster meets conflict, and perhaps also reflect on those 5, 6 issues Mihir already shared with us. Saskia, would you like to go first this time, and then we go to Flora? Is that okay?
Yes, sure. Okay, yeah, I actually was reflecting on what Thea said, that many times we actually working in a context, but the reason to be there is the humanitarian response or the work on risk vulnerability hazards, and then we find the violence and the conflict situation once we are there. And that was actually one of the cases. So the challenges, I was trying the other day to remember all of them, and actually this morning I remembered more and more came up, because I never did actually this work of systemizing what was the experience and what were the challenges. So in the urban setting, it was as a high-risk urban informal settlement, which, as I said before, with this extensive risk, with all these localized landslides and floods. So one of the challenges was the access of the community. There's no way you could access the community if you were not escorted by the leaders and you were not negotiating access with them. This meant that was for the humanitarian actors, but also for the first response. For example, the firemen, the response brigade of the state had absolutely no access to the community, because there were stories that sometimes they would smuggle in opposite gang members in the ambulance. So access was totally forbidden also for them. So that made actually an issue on who was going to give first respond after an event. So there was the community, we had to be escorted by the leaders. Then this is also going back to the tools that Mihir actually talked about. We were carrying out the vulnerability and capacity assessment, which actually done jointly with the Guatemalan Red Cross and the Red Cross Federation. And we were doing the classic kind of tool, but then at some point we had to adapt all the tools, because the main issue and the main vulnerabilities that came out and the main risk from the community was violence. So we did this interesting work of adapting the tools for the vulnerability and capacity assessment to expand them, as Mihir said, to work in that specific context. Then this I remembered this morning. Also, the community, it was not a big community, it was quite small, and a community is actually in the center of Guatemala City, next door to the main government building. It was an informal settlement that was built 50 years ago, but it was still an informal settlement. That the community was divided. There was this invisible border between areas, and one area was controlled from a gang and another area was controlled from the other gang. So you could never cross from one side to the other one. You actually had to negotiate your access and wait for the leaders of the other one to actually cross you, but the worst thing would be to get out of the community and get in from the other side, so the both gang members were not meet themselves. So that was also an issue for evacuation route. Once a hazard would impact the community, where the units go through, and you would never see that. Was totally invisible. You would only know that once you knew the context and you had a clear localized understanding. And then for sure there were also cases that community members would not go to the trainings for risk of violence. Training times would have to be very much negotiated because it was a very unsafe area to work around. That is for the urban. And then on the rural area, it was actually we were working, that was mainly after the Hurricane Mitch response, so many years ago at the beginning of my career. But it was a time when Guatemala was getting more and more controlled by drug cartel. It was actually a period when the drug cartels were actually kind of moving from Colombia to the operation to Mexico and Guatemala, due to the favorable impunity context that was actually kind of cultive, and that would expand. And there were some communities which would just say, no, we don't want to work with no humanitarian actors. We have our illegal airstrip for drug dealing. That is our business. So we don't want anybody else working in that community. So you simply could not work in those contexts. That was not a humanitarian response context. It was more work of disaster risk reduction, where community highly exposed to flooding. So we could not access at the end. I'll stop there, but it was a very interesting exercise to reflect on the personal experience and try to find all these relations between how.
Thank you, Saskia. Thank you so much. It's a very rich contributions for both speakers already, but Thea, I'm going first to ask Flora to add something more to that. So, and then it's your challenge to bring it all together, Thea, after this first round. Flora, could you please elaborate a little bit on the challenges you discovered when disaster meets conflict? I think you need to unmute yourself. Maybe I can do it for you. Yes, there you are.
Thanks. So, yeah, since particularly engaging in 2015 and up to date, my personal experience and all this the conflicts and humanitarian responses that we are providing, and the most challenges that I find is this disaster and humanitarian action is put as or perceived as non-political element. And that is the most challenging part. So yeah, it's like, yeah, if in this academic term, and I don't know, maybe you might call it as this depoliticization, something like that. But since, yeah, this is the most challenging part issue in the in the context that I'm working with, I'm that this risk, looking at the risk and the vulnerability has also come with the structure that impose to be into risks, to be risks and to be vulnerable. So that has the pre-existing structure already there. For example, like if we're looking at the cyclone common in Chin State and also in Rakhine State, it is that the pre-existing risk of being vulnerable is already because of these something like illegal logging and then navigating the land for road construction without having a proper consensus of the public and so on. So these are kind of the people who are in, or the community per se that we are talking is in risk is due to the fact that the pre-existing structure that intrude them into that position. But when it's come to addressing those disaster, conflict, it is still on the way. Every agent or most of the actor, including to respond those scenario, try to the biggest problem is depoliticizing the issues and the response as well. So as if everyone has to put this as a very neutral sense, but in the end, it is not neutral. And expecting everyone to be neutral, but it is not. And then it's like we are working in like a kind of pretending or a superficial communication or talking about the issue and responding about the issue. This is very challenging. Looking at the country that the country I'm from, is also the disaster and conflict is also defined. We cannot ignore looking at our political system, the constitution, which is given the crisis to be legitimate power to the military, something like that. So if looking into the responding to those disasters is also when we talk about the government, and then the government, the general administration who has a security mandate is the one who is responding, coordinating different forms of different actors, coordinating for response. So this already is a very challenging for a local actor, to be in that coordination mechanism. And also, what more we have been challenging, we face challenges are like donors, and also international, including the UN, because all the coordination is based on the data. So the making of data, and then this is really a humanitarian discourse at under the name of the data. So becoming, for example, like becoming legitimizing the IDP or legitimizing a victim of the flood or landslide, it has a power. So this is only if the government categorize these are the IDP and the victim, and then most of the agency, including the UN and the INGO and the donor communities, are following that trend. So this is really challenging. But what is happening on the ground is it is just a matter of the political power, who can say more about who are the victims and who are not. And this we are finding so much challenging on that issue. And also implementation or in partnership with, practically responding to those scenario. It's very challenging is the issues of the commitment or the lack of commitment or the poor commitment of the localization, which is which has been talked about in 2016 in World Humanitarian Summit. But in practical, in reality, in the country that I'm working, it is not in place. Theoretically, it is accepted, but where is the instrument of this localization? We can check into funding issue, what is about the mutual and respectful equal partnership between the donor, international organization, and the local actors. And then even for local actors, overhead cost of 7% is still every organization could not access. And then most of, sadly, the donors, institution, and then UN are not prepared to kind of, prepare, especially in the humanitarian scenario, it is not prepared to make access for the local organizations. And also the inclusion, the local actors are the most of, crisis affected community, and they should be, or we should be the one who is in the center of decision making, and which is we are so much lacking for inclusion aspect. And then coordination, I have talked already. There is a very from the government, if the government is holding every cluster coordination, and the GAD or others ministry who has been who has security mandate to support these military. So this is really very challenging for us as well. And then lastly, what I want to say is donor countries aspect. So when we are addressing the Cyclone Coleman, we have been taught that including the World Bank and JICA and all these institutions, and for the building back better future, in the name of that slogan, and that have been these institutions has been committing for a funding. But what we have observed is we are more seeing the marketization of their products. They export to our country to buy this machine and this, how do you call this, engineering material, that infrastructure. So the country has been looking for the government, our government, they have been more ended up into indebted for purchasing more of the products produced by these donor countries as well. So where really is the moral commitment and the moral value for saying building back better future, and also the commitment for the disaster affected communities? So that will be my point of issues that we face challenges in summary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flora. Indeed, the panel, they bring in many, many aspects, all very relevant and important. I'm glad to see Thea nodding. Perhaps you can highlight some of the issues addressed by the panelists and explain how it resonates within the research you've been doing for the last 5 years, and what main questions we are posed before. Thea, please.
Yeah, again, there's so many rich issues, and they all speak for themselves, and it's very difficult to sort of see, how to bring it together. But there are two things that stand out for me. One is that it may sound a bit soft, but I feel so much admiration when I hear you talk, all three of you, and then I realize, and I've known this for quite some time, that humanitarians that are in the field, they are like diplomats, doers, compassionate, all at the same time, and so creative in finding these solutions. And I just see all these images in front of my eyes on how you negotiate your way between two gangs and talk with the government when the government is monopolizing the data, and how you perhaps find some inroads into that, and all those kind of huge challenges that you put in front of us and that you deal with every day. So I really like to express my respect for the way that humanitarians deal with all these things in their multiple ways. And that is perhaps also why we so emphasize the importance of learning and exchanging. You would just hope that all that wisdom, all that accumulated wisdom of humanitarians sort of finds its way into more exchange and learning and more strategizing about all these questions of advocacy and all that. And the other thing that strikes me really is this notion of multiplicity of risks. That's the way that Mihir express it, but I see it everywhere. And one of the things that's coming back in several of the stories is that how humanitarians are actually boxed into not their mandate, but into the projects they have. And that, you know, when you are assigned by a donor and your project is to deal with this particular disaster, you don't even have so much room for maneuver to deal with all the other challenges you find, even though risks are multiple, risks are integrated. But projects, as they are being commissioned by donors, are very often single focused. Now, I know that since the Humanitarian Summit, there is at least at the level of slogans, the very sincere desire to bridge humanitarianism, development, and peace building. And one could only hope that we will advance in the years to come to really be more open to more integrated approaches. And what I would hope is that donors become more trustful towards humanitarian agencies and enable and allow them to take more flexibility in how they work with the funds they have in these situations of multiplicity of risk. Because I can totally see when you're being sent somewhere to just deliver your food aid or build your 5 schools, it's very difficult to go around it and think, oh, but actually we would like to work as well on this or that or the other, because we see those are very pressing risks for the local communities. So that those would perhaps be 2 things, Peter, I would like to bring in at this point.
Thank you so much, Thea. So the accumulated wisdom of humanitarian knowledge, and please, how can we make more use of it? And the other one is the multiplicity of risks. And humanitarians have to cope with many different challenges at the same time. But projects are often very single-minded, and perhaps the donors behind it as well. I go back to the panel and see how they would like to reflect on these 2 main points you highlighted for us, Thea. I think this time I go the other way around. Is that okay? So I start with Flora, then I go to Saskia, and then I go to Mihir. Flora, we start with you. Is that okay? Are you with us, Flora?
I cannot, my line is not so good at the moment.
So I start with Saskia then. Is that okay with you? Yeah, I think we go first to Saskia and see how Flora, if she can come back later. Saskia, can you reflect on the main points of Thea first?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this multiplicity of risk. Actually, I wanted to do it from when Mihir said it, and conceptualize a systemic risk. You know, since the Global Assessment Report of 2019, we, at least UNDR, has been pushing for this idea and this concept of systemic risk, which is actually this multiplicity. Things are uncertain, things are interconnected, they are non-linear. And actually yesterday when I was reflecting on this conflict and meeting disaster and looking at readings, for example, the COVID crisis. COVID crisis was a health crisis that then impacted all the other dimensions of society, and impacting other dimensions then, or other systems, this came back and impacted other ones. For example, the COVID, the closing up of schools And the ones who are actually not being able to go to school, at least online on homeschooling, that my kids are doing now since many months, are the ones who are more vulnerable, have no access to internet, but that also increases the risk for them to be recruited as armed children in conflict. So that's another kind of possible impact of a health crisis. So you can see how all these different systems, there's multiplicity of hazards, complex scenario, or multiplicity of risk are actually a manifestation of this concept of systemic risk. So, and also the basic interview that the interrelation that if you have a disaster, then there's more risk for conflict to arise, or when there is conflict, vulnerabilities are even worse. So when a disaster strikes, it's even more harder to attend the situation. So this double link between disaster and conflict, which is clear in the research, is also an expression and a manifestation of what we've been calling a systemic risk. So I wanted to point out this point specifically on Thea's comment.
Thank you so much. Mihir, would you like to follow up on Saskia?
Sure. I thought the best way would be to give three examples. And the first example I would like to give is I was doing an evaluation for Oxfam International after tsunami, and with a team which was led by our leader, Adrian Firth. And we were looking at the local partners of the international NGO, how they were recovering in the middle of this LTT conflict going on. And the women's group that were being supported there invariably mentioned, and we talked about it from one side to another, invariably mentioned about, which I would now label as economy of peace, or economy of peace and non-violence, if you will, economy of well-being, economy of nurturance. So those were the ideas already there in tsunami recovery. And somehow they don't get picked up because we are talking about tsunami and how that natural disaster is affected. So I think to pick up much larger economic ideas from the field becomes very important. So that's the first response in terms of an example. The second example I would like to give is from a webinar that was organized at Stockholm University by Manuel Raju and his students and some of the other faculty members. And they were looking at, and there I realized that the monopoly of the state in disaster response and conflict response is somehow we've taken for granted, that the state is there and we have to take for granted, but should we take it for granted? Should that not be questioned at some point and see that, if all the work is being done, most of the work is being done by civil society, local organizations, shouldn't that be questioned? So that's and also the boundaries, colonial boundaries that these states carry with them. So we have inherited them, but must we keep them, and can we play around and sort of change that differently? So that's something I would offer as an example. And the last example would be the work that we were doing with Global Network of Disaster Risk Reduction, GNDR, which is being done by Vijay Kumar. And they have just finished a whole global survey of voices from the frontier. On the ground, what is it that people are? It's a huge, very important survey. And I was looking at the findings as far just day before yesterday. And among many things, one thing it says, which is common when the disaster meets conflict, is livelihood and work. Invariably, work and livelihood predominates in terms of what do people want affected by disasters and conflicts simultaneously. And somehow our focus remains relief and rehabilitation, not work and livelihood. So that's something very puzzling. So what we need to do perhaps is go to unconventional sources, something that we did with Jennifer Leaning and Sachit, as far as we're looking at the partition of India. And of course, it was a large, violent, humanitarian crisis perhaps ever seen. But during that, there was droughts and there was floods and there was landslides and cyclones. And during that 1 year, 1947, these smaller but large, very large impact natural disasters came up. And how were they dealt with while this partition was going on? Is again tells us that if you go to non-conventional sources, which do not necessarily have institutional agenda, then you are able to pick up that how this actually happens. So these would be the 4 examples I'd like to offer to the question, so that we can rethink about what we are doing and what we plan to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you. Mihir, Flora, I will check with you if you have anything to add to this. Otherwise, I will go back to Thea. Would you like to add anything on the stories of Mihir and Saskia, initiated by the questions of Thea about the multiplicity of risks and the need to harvest and to bring further the strategic knowledge we already have, but we might better share with each other? Would you like to reflect on it, or shall I go to Thea directly?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, my line is not interrupting in between. So yeah, could you please repeat the question again?
Would you like to add anything on what Saskia and Mihir shared with us on those main points Thea posed to us? Like we have a lot of accumulated wisdom in humanitarianism, but we need to harvest it better and to bring it further on a strategical level. And the other one was about the multiplicity of risks. Many challenges at the same time, but many projects are very focused. How do you deal with it? Otherwise, I go to Thea. But if you would like to add anything, please do so.
Yeah, I think I will go later with the Thea.
Of course, no problem at all. Okay, Thea, again, a lot of information, and we also are running fast in our time. Officially, we have like 15 minutes left, and we also asked our panelists about recommendations, both for policy and practice. But first, maybe you can reflect on the responses of Saskia and Mihir.
Yeah, well, I think there are actually already a lot of recommendations flowing from everything we've heard so far. And what I like about the discussion now, well, on the one hand, we go to the systems risk, of course, Saskia, which is extremely important that we look at that. But I also like very much that we are going, it seems, to go a level more down to the communities. And what are the solutions proposed by community members? What is it that their priority needs are? Because we can think of the multiplicity of risks, but what is the priority needs that people see? They have all sort of needs, but what is the priority? And I totally agree with me here. It also resonates in our research that very often it's livelihoods that are at the forefront of what people need. And I'm very excited about ways that for example, in sort of material turn in peace building, that they use livelihood programs to advance peace, or use livelihood programs to advance the protection against climate change, as the Partners for Resilience do. So I really find it extremely interesting how we have moved in this discussion to what the donors do and don't, what humanitarians can and can't. And by the end of the day, we all realize that what we really need to do is listen to the communities and see where their priority needs are and how stuff can get integrated at the level of the communities. Finally, and just as a very small, I also take this as a social gathering, so I find it lovely to hear me here refer to Adriaan Verf, BJ Kumar, who are also participating in this webinar. So welcome to the two of them. And we can't, not everybody is having the space to speak, but it's really nice to hear and to see how a sort of community of researchers gets together in this kind of webinar. So this is really rich for me.
Thank you, Thea. We need to bring it maybe back to a level, also back to a level more down, to community level. Mihir and Saskia, we need to listen better to the communities. Mihir, would you please start? Yeah, you are unmuted, yes.
Community, yes, very much. But I sort of want to, I'm tempted to, if I'm allowed to sort of raise somewhat overwhelming question that comes to my mind, and that has been sort of quite recurring, not so practical in the sense of we can't turn that into projects or programs or research question. But I feel that when disasters and conflict meet, that whole we, because of the institutional structures that we have, may it be UN or NGOs or authorities, we've sort of taken this market neoclassical, neoliberal approach to markets for granted. And all we are trying to do is within that market approach. So as long as there is a certain type of demand to respond to vulnerability, we'll have certain type of supply to respond to vulnerability. And as long there is a market for food and water, we'll do that. And if there is a market for more sort of psychosocial support, we'll do that. So to me, it seems before we sort of start going practically on the ground with the communities, would be very nice to see that does this economic model allow us to think beyond what we have been able to think and do so far. That is, can there be a economic way which allows us to go beyond neoliberal economics of markets, so that humanitarian action can be far more fulfilling and far more full than it is right now. I just see that as an impediment to going all that we can do within this particular economic structure. We have done almost, and we can do it differently here and there. But unless that that economic structures are changed, I don't think we'll be able to go beyond what we've already tried. It would be tinkering, genuinely very much committed and very, very honest, but still it would be within the part of the system and not the way, because this system will lead us to, this system, let me sum up, will lead us to more disasters and more conflict. There is no way we can deny that. And so shouldn't we look at how the system itself is leading to something which is which should be avoided first, then see how disasters and conflict can meet more meaningfully for the local people who are affected or are likely to affect. Thank you.
Oh, that is indeed me here. And I think it's very nice what you now say, because it also brings back the intervention of Saskia earlier. And I think this is what you're saying is so well illustrated by COVID-19 at the moment. That is sort of, for me, so evident how it shows like all the shortcomings of the neoliberal market-oriented thinking, because now at COVID-19, it's the states that have to come in and step in with their social policies, and it isn't the markets that actually help us too much. So anyway, that might be also like a personal connection we have here, and thinking about how neoliberalism is not helping out in these kind of questions, and not helping out in putting the communities in the center of our attention. But I thought it was very nice how this comes together. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you both. A big issue. Our system is leading to new conflicts. Thank you, Mia. Saskia, would you like to respond to what Mihir and Thea addressed? And then I go to Flora, because I think she's very close to local communities. So I really would love to hear her reflections on it as well. Saskia, please.
Yes, I was actually thinking that community are complex. They're not uniform. And especially in conflict situations, when disaster meet conflicts, they're even more complex. There's many different voices, many different interests, many different realities. So many times humanitarian actors also work with what they have, because they have to be fast. That's actually bring it to also the research finding that you need to have a better understanding of the context, to have your scenarios, to strategize. So I just wanted to remind that we talk about the community, but community itself is not a uniform structure. There's different levels of vulnerability, of interest, and in conflict and disaster, it's even more complex. So I just wanted to highlight that little important dimension when talking about communities.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Flora, when we're talking about communities, local communities, and how we need to listen to them, what are your experiences?
Well, yeah, my organization is a community-based organization, and I am a community for some extent. So for the community is we need, as I mentioned before, it is our biggest problem is the politicization of the issue and the response and the engagement. So we need to open up the space for us to participate, so that our voice and concern need to be heard, and we have a chance to speak for that. And that is very important. And we need that specific room for having the ownership of the problem and also the solution, because the local we have the knowledge of the complexity of the local community. So somehow when we say even if it is local, but for the case of Chin, even if we say the local community, and it's very big question that who are the local, because our community is also involved from diaspora's community as well. So very complex communities. We have knowledge and we have engaged with this this network, so that that our participation in the issue is very important. I would like to highlight. And then that room to facilitate, to happen into for us to allow to engage into that kind of spaces, it's very important that we really need to make sure that this localization has been practiced and to be concrete and cemented into practical level, not as just a talk and just a word, but into practice. This is really important for a local community.
Thank you, Flora. Thank you so much. Well, Thea, we are almost going to an end of this webinar. We have some 10 minutes left, and I'm just figuring how we can make it like doing a good wrap up and doing right to all those introductions and thoughts we have been sharing so far. There has been a lot going on also in the Q&A box and in the chat box, but I see many of the team already answered most of the questions. There were some questions also about recovery we could address. There were questions about, do we share the discussions in the chat box, in the Q&A box. We will preserve all those information, and we will find a way into the research brief. But if people really would like to read the chat and the Q&As, I think we can only do it anonymized without clearing the names of the people. But if people really feel uncomfortable, if you share those chats and the questions, please let me know, then we won't share them, of course. Thea, what would be a good question for a final round? We have 5 minutes left or something. Maybe the main policy recommendation for either an NGO or a government or an academic institution, what would be their main assignment for the others? Is that a good final question, do you think, Thea?
Yeah, it might very well be, Peter, but for me is now a real question as well is, and I'm really touched by the last contribution of Flora. What I gather from her is that yes, localization is the key and going to the communities is the key, but somehow it will not happen unless local actors own their own space. And this is something that comes straight to my heart, to be honest, because I have been working in this for so long. I've seen so many top-down reforms, top-down announcement of change in the humanitarian sector. And I honestly believe that unless people from below start to own their space and advocate to get more voice and be able to do something for their communities, it's very difficult to realize. And of course, owning space sounds very easy in a way, but how you do that in an area where there are also local conflicts and local contradictions. So I could really like to see perhaps some statements on what type of opportunities people see to approach this from a local level. What is the opportunity for local communities to actually own their space, as Flora mentioned it? She called it like that. Huh?
Flora, would you like to go first then, because you initiated this one? To own your own space. Maybe it are simple words, but it can be so complex. Please.
Yeah, owning it for that space is, yeah, for the first step, like the context that I am working. We need to looking at the international community support for creating and supporting that space, and that will be look like the UN and also the donor organizations to commit into practice that yeah, they can put in policy, and then even if each organization endorses the headquarter, and that already apply to all countries, and they have a very good and very strong bureaucratic system as well. So it will, I'm sure that it will work. But the thing is that we have been advocating for this localization together with the other CSO. We have been saying that, yeah, just to the HQ is endorsed and then all will apply. But until now, we don't see any substantive moving forward to this policy or this principle. And also for and also for the local has been also very complicated, as I mentioned, that we do not much very passive and very very passive for the problem, as it is power is coming from everywhere, and we also, the local community is also manipulating and then exploiting the issues as well. So if I should name in the principles of the humanitarian, it will be like the religious group who has been coming up with a very substantive local value, faith, and then this is somehow a very challenging. And then that kind of boundary needs to be draw farther and then stronger. And then local needs to be our community. Local community needs to be not to be step up to be as in a very active agency and to politicize these humanitarian issues and this all conflict around as well. That will be my yeah, let me stop now at that.
Thank you so much, Flora. Thank you. Saskia, local people should own their own space. Local actors should own their own space. How are we going to manage? How are they going to manage that?
Yeah, I was writing down my notes and moving around this question. The first that actually comes is who of the community, just to go back to my comment, because again, there's so many voices. So who is the one in the community to spear front this localization of humanitarian action? And then I saw a question when, okay, then how? And then more traditional focus like capacity building, the issue of access of funding, who controls the resources and who implements them. Is there somebody outside who's actually taking all the decision and the local part is just implementing? What is the level of decision making through this funding? This also brings to what I think Thea said at the beginning of the having sometimes it's very strict and there's a lack of fluidity in the humanitarian funding and action. And then it also started thinking about partnership is the local level, but then the local level also needs to work in partnership with different levels, with maybe the local government, then other different levels, which are totally different from the context. I cannot give a generalized statement on that, because some contexts there's no local government, some contexts local government is against the community. So acknowledging that. And then I was also thinking of multi-sectoral. What are the sectors of the community? How do they work together? Because as we said very clearly during the webinars, there's a multiplicity of needs, and needs go one on top of the other one. So how do you navigate and decide which is the most priority, and how all the different sectors at community level, because when we talk about multi-sector, it's from the state level, how these talk to each other. And actually with the research, we find that many times they don't talk too much to each other, especially when it's the conflict sector with the DRR or response sector, but that also can happen at community level. So how these different sectors work with them. And then I kept writing down, but that's my main thoughts to the question.
Thank you, Saskia. I don't think you're the only one who's constantly writing down, because I'm writing down as well. I see Thea all the time also going like this. I mean, here, please, your final remarks, perhaps also on how can local actors reclaim their space.
Yeah, I was going through, I sort of described 6 or 7 areas where disasters met conflict in our work in the beginning. And when I was going through that, I also looked at it, what is it which has lasted all these years? What is it which is still standing? Which, you know, if I go back now and I'll actually see, and what that exists at community level is the organizations of the people, people's organization, their economic organizations. It may be a farmers cooperative we worked with, and that is there. It may be a vendors cooperative. It may be a union of masons, which was rebuilding after the earthquake. So when people were organized around an economic activity to deal with conflict and disaster, and when investments were made into that people's organization, democratic, it may be a federation, it may be association, self-help group, for example, credit union, a trade union, if you will, then they have lasted beyond relief, rehabilitation, recovery. And it's invariably the case in all the um, uh, seven situations I explained. And the kind of active sort of things which changed those people's organizations or people's economic organization were the four areas where that activities have transformed, if you will. And one is that, as I said before, when they were organized around work, livelihood, and they were making living out of whatever activity that was coming up. That made a sort of difference. Second is when they had access to market. So if they were producing something, making something, selling something, and if these people's organizations had access to local market beyond, outside, host country, so on and so forth. Third was if they had social protection. So some sort of social protection, of course, there is no state in many cases, but some social protection measures made tremendous difference for these people's organizations to reclaim the space. And the fourth was to build their capacity to function as an organization, to get registered if that's possible, have regular meetings, steering committee, keeping accounts, so on and so forth. So in short, people's organizations around economic activities in disaster or conflict overlap have survived beyond relief, rehabilitation, recovery. So perhaps that's something we may want to look at more carefully and see more investment there. So localization, not generally in communities, but within community, farmers federations, women's self-help groups, credit unions, Masons Association that exist. And they do in every community they do. So we should go there. That's something we found from the 6 or 7 cases. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you. Yeah, because I was just wondering, very valuable instruments you give us, but you say indeed the local communities do it, but do they have the position to reclaim it? It's their own space, or are there other forces that are just keeping them away from reclaiming their own space?
They do, they don't, and the role of the outsiders, such as us, it may be a local NGO, international NGO, authorities, it may be UN. Their role is to make whatever efforts that are being made by local economic activities or local economic organizations of the poor to support them so that they are able to reclaim. Sometimes they do it on their own. They are possible to do that, and we've seen examples of that. Sometimes they can't and you need support. Sometimes you need to go beyond relief to give institutional support. But it's possible to do that. In fact, in each of the cases that I described, there is something concretely standing right now. As we speak, we worked with Ladakh in Leh. There was a flash flood. And we worked with a very small group of 40 women who were selling warm clothes. And they were organized into a small little cooperative. And it's now 8-9 years, and it's still their activities going on. And they have prospered to an extent, and they've done well. So I think when you focus on not delivery of food, relief, or shelter, which is of course needed, absolutely, but when we go beyond that, you are able to create such local people's organizations. We had a very good chance to go to the tsunami-affected Tamil Nadu coast after almost 10 years. And we were the 4 of us, and we went and looked at what happened to these people after 10 years. And invariably, we found that where these self-help groups, unions, cooperatives were supported, sometimes ActionAid, sometimes state government, sometimes UNDP, but they existed after 10 years. Everything else had vanished. Houses existed, of course, but everything else is. So I think it's possible, not easy and not always, but it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihir. Thea, we're almost over time. We're already over time, 6 minutes over time. Well, just when Mihir mentioned the frame, go beyond. Both today and yesterday, several times, I heard the frame, we need to go beyond the way we used to do, beyond the practice we now practice. Thea, maybe you have some beautiful final remarks for us, or your main lesson of this debate of this afternoon, and maybe the working sessions of yesterday and today, to finish up and to round up this webinar, and also this 5 years of study and this research project.
Peter,
Well,
thank
Peter,
you. And Tia,
yeah,
thank you.
what
so
I
much.
yeah, thank you also Mihir. What I'm thinking now more than anything else, Peter, is that what for me comes from this discussion is starting with and from the communities and realizing that it's not easy, because communities are also not homogeneous. There's lots of competition, there's this and that and the other. But we also keep investing in getting governments to work together, in getting the UN to work together, in getting humanitarian agencies to work together. And I mean, Dirk Salomon said this beautiful comment in the bar, like, humanitarian agencies are all also different and competing and everything, yet we keep systematically investing in that they work together. So such a similar systematic investment starting from the community level, that is now, I think, what I will be chewing on for the next few weeks. And finally, Peter, if I may, given the huge interest for those of you who don't have enough, one of the things we did in our project was to set up a MOOC, which is a massive online open course, in which this whole issue of when disaster meets conflicts, dilemmas, many of the things we talk about today have been dealt with. I'm just putting the website link in the chat bar. And I just thought that any one of you who likes to continue to go beyond this afternoon, this could be a very nice way of doing it. And it's totally for free. You can shop around there are 6 lectures or 6 weeks, so to speak, but you can do it in any way you like. And so if you want to know more, our website is there with all the publications, but also the MOOC, which I just shared a link with. It's also a very nice way that you and your colleagues may go deeper into the issue. We already had 1,500 participants to the MOOC. It's rated very high, 4.8 out of 5. So it's really worth your while. And Peter, I understand you're now closing. I know you will be closing, but can I just say thank you on behalf of the team and myself to everybody who is here, because I really, really appreciate it. All of you found so much time today to come to our webinar. So I really would like to thank you, but I know it's Peter's role, so I'm handing back to Peter.
Thank you, Thea. Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists. Many, many thanks to Flora Bawi Neymawi, to Saskia Kursi, and to Mihir Bhatt. I would like to thank the research team, Samantha Melis, Isabel Deport, Juana van Vorst, and Rodrigo Mena, and all the others which are working in this project. And I really would like to thank Thea Hilhorst for initiating this research project and also having this beautiful role in this webinar. Thank you all, and hope to see you again soon. We will share the findings of this debate and of the research in a policy brief, in a research brief, and we will email it to all participants. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.